The northern wind howled through the trees at the edge of Denali National Park as Emily Harper tightened the straps of her pack. She could feel the sting of ice in the air, not yet visible on her breath, but hiding in the cold whisper of the storm ahead. Her boots pressed into the snow-crusted earth like they had 1,000 times before. She had been preparing for this climb for nearly 2 years, but something about this morning felt heavier than the pack on her back. There was no cheering crowd, no farewell hug from a support team. There was only her reflection in the frosted truck window and the quiet determination that lived deep inside her chest. Emily Harper was here to make history, but she did not come for fame. She came for proof. She scribbled a note on a laminated card and slipped it into the fold of her down jacket. For Sadie, it read, "Love you more than the summit." Her daughter had just turned 10 the week before, and they had eaten cake under the glow of string lights in the backyard of their small home in Bend, Oregon. The girl had begged her to stay and had fallen asleep gripping her mother's wool climbing mitt like a blanket. Emily had promised she would return, not with medals, not with headlines, but with a story worth telling. Behind her, the gates of the ranger station creaked in the wind. There was no one to stop her. She had filed the permits, submitted her plan, and double-checked every contingency. She was to be the first American woman to attempt a solo winter ascent of Denali without external support. It was reckless by most standards. No team, no Sherpa, no satellite phone except for a backup beacon sealed in a waterproof container buried in her final cache. But she had something more potent than gear. She had intent. 3 weeks earlier, she had mapped every route by hand, color-coded in Sharpie on a topographical chart. What she did not know and could not imagine was that her ex-husband Daniel Harper had found a photocopy of that same chart folded between pages in a family cookbook left behind during the divorce. Daniel was a former Air Force rescue pilot who had spent 8 years flying in and out of Arctic zones. He had studied those notations like a classified mission file. And, in a decision he never shared with anyone, he packed his own gear and flew to Anchorage 2 days behind her, telling no one but the wilderness. He intended to shadow her trail from a safe distance, not to interfere, but to watch from afar in case things went wrong. Emily, meanwhile, had reached the second base camp and was preparing to cross the early ridge toward the northern Icefield. On her 5th night, she dug a snow trench to shield herself from a bitter wind sweeping across the lower saddle. As she unfolded her thermal blanket and checked her supplies, she noticed something strange buried beneath a shallow drift. It was a tightly packed bundle in a weatherproof bag, barely visible under a cluster of rocks. She almost dismissed it as debris left by a previous climber, but something about the precise placement made her stop. Inside was a small sealed pouch labeled Survival Kit with no markings. There was an extra layer of medical gauze, an energy gel pack, and a compass. Nothing extraordinary except the gel flavor was cherry citrus. It was the same one Daniel used to carry on every winter flight. She stared at the pouch for several seconds, her pulse quiet but steady. She told herself it was coincidence. It had to be. Daniel was in Texas training new cadets. He had not spoken to her in 6 months, but she still tucked the pack into her sled just in case. On day 6, Daniel had reached the edge of a frozen ravine not far from where Emily had camped. He moved quietly, taking care not to leave traces too close to her trail. From a distance, he spotted the faint outline of her tent, a speck of synthetic red in a world of white. He felt relief flood his chest, followed by guilt. He had no right to be here. They had divorced on fair terms. There was no unfinished business between them except the kind you never really write down. She had always been the stronger one. Even in the harshest fights, she had stood with her spine straight and her voice calm. But when he heard she was climbing Denali alone in February, something inside him refused to sit still. Emily, unaware of the silent witness tailing her ascent, pressed onward toward the glacier rim. The temperature dropped below -20 at sunset. She lit a small flame inside a tin mug, warming her fingers before sealing her jacket around her neck. Her radio chirped once. It was a test signal she had programmed for every checkpoint. She responded with a brief voice log time-stamped and archived to her handheld recorder. Her words were simple, still moving. Ridge ahead, energy good. Thinking of Sadie, that night her sleep was broken by wind gusts hammering the thin nylon of her shelter. In the hours before sunrise, she pulled out a postcard from Sadie folded in plastic. The girl had drawn a mountain and written, "Come home to me," in a purple marker. Emily smiled at the drawing, then curled into her sleeping bag. Her face was chapped from the cold, but her eyes held fire. She did not fear the climb. She feared fading from memory. She feared her daughter growing up without a story that proved courage did not belong only to men or legends. She feared the silence that settles over forgotten names. Meanwhile, Daniel studied the shifting weather reports. A storm was forming over the southern basin, but Emily's intended route might skim just below it. He decided to cut crosswise through an old avalanche path to gain time. In doing so, he triggered a small slip of snow that rolled into a deep crevasse. He caught himself against a jagged outcrop, ripping his jacket but keeping balance. It was a warning from the mountain, a reminder that even ghosts could fall. In the morning, Emily approached the first major ridge where ice meets sky in jagged plates. She paused to document the landscape with a shaky hand. In the frame of the photo she captured far behind and almost invisible, a faint shadow moved across the slope. It was not wind, it was not snow, but she never saw it. She only took the picture, stored it, and pressed on toward the cold whisper of the summit that was calling her name. By the 8th day of the climb, Emily Harper had reached a critical turning point in her expedition. The wind patterns shifted from west to northeast, bringing a sharp drop in temperature and visibility. The slopes ahead were partially veiled by ground snow, swept sideways like smoke. She stopped beneath an overhanging rock sheet to check her route and gauge her altitude. Her altimeter read 13,100 feet. She logged her position, drank from a heat retention flask, and powered on her GPS. It blinked red once, then went black. She tried again, holding it up to the sky, but the device refused to respond. Batteries fully charged, no water exposure. She checked the transmitter beacon inside her pack. That, too, remained silent. Her fingers were beginning to stiffen. She warmed them against her chest and made a mental note to descend slightly and try again later. The clouds were closing in fast. But more concerning than the failing electronics was the thought that she was now moving into a zone where backup was no longer an option. 30 miles south and 2 days behind, Daniel Harper had set camp along a glacial outcrop lined with fern. He reviewed the printed map Emily had drawn by hand. Her red markings led toward a narrow ridgeline and then crossed a shelf known for heavy snowdrifts and unstable crevices. He circled a small area near the ridge and made a note to intercept at the final rest point marked in pen. That was the spot she had chosen for her long acclimatization break. Daniel had no radio connection to her nor any knowledge of the failing signals. He packed up his gear quickly and began his ascent, racing daylight and trusting muscle memory over visibility. He had done rescues in worse terrain, but this was different. This was personal. This was not a mission filed with the Air Force. This was a pact he had made in silence. Back on the ridge, Emily tried to maintain her routine. She still logged her coordinates by hand. She still recorded daily audio logs even if they might never be heard. That night, as she lay inside her tent with the wind shaking the walls like paper, she heard a faint crackle on the emergency band of her handheld radio. A voice broke through briefly, low and unclear, then faded out. She sat up quickly, tuned the dial slowly, and listened again. Nothing. She tapped the side of the radio and adjusted her position, then heard it again. A voice similar to her own, speaking 3 clipped words. Altitude holding stable. She froze. She had not transmitted anything. The signal was being broadcast. She replayed the audio and the same sentence repeated once more before vanishing again. She felt a chill deeper than the cold air. No one else should be using her code phrases. The following morning, she hiked along a tight bend above a frozen cliffside. There, she noticed something that made her stop. A shallow indent in the snow, half filled by drift, seemed to show the remnants of a boot print. It was old, partially erased by the wind, but unmistakably recent compared to the surrounding texture. She looked around but saw nothing else. No tracks leading away, no gear, no sign of a second person. She brushed snow from the ridge wall and examined the nearby slope. The terrain here was seldom used. Most climbers avoided it in winter due to exposure and wind risk. She moved forward cautiously, her breath visible in short bursts, and logged the discovery in her journal without comment. She needed to keep her focus. Meanwhile, Daniel had also reached a critical elevation. As he moved past a crevice near the second ice shelf, he stopped to rest and noticed something half buried in the snowpack. He brushed away the frost and found a torn tag from a sleeping bag brand he recognized. The name, stitched on the fabric, read E. Harper. His heart pounded as he turned in place and scanned the surroundings. He called out once, not expecting an answer, then adjusted his gear and quickened his pace. He began to notice subtle signs along the trail, a broken crampon mark, a discarded wrapper, an impression from a collapsed snow wall that matched the footprint pattern of a solo shelter. He knew her style. She had a method for everything. But the trail was growing colder and the air thinner. His breathing became labored. Still, he kept going. That night, Emily pitched her tent behind a snow boulder and began boiling water. The wind sounded harsher here with low groans like distant engines. She had almost forgotten what voices sounded like. Just before sleep, she unrolled her daughter's letter again. The ink had begun to fade slightly, but the drawing still made her smile. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, then listened to her recorder's last entry. Her voice played back softly. I am here. I am strong. I am thinking of home. But then another voice interrupted the playback. It was the same sentence from the night before. Altitude holding stable. She snapped the recorder shut and turned off the device. 50 feet below her campsite, a small antenna protruded from the snow, its wire chewed and frozen. A fox had likely clawed through it the night before. Her transmitter's signal was being scattered, its beacon fractured. At the ranger station below, the team monitoring emergency frequencies noticed a sudden flare in Emily's signal logs, showing her location hundreds of miles east of her true position. They dismissed it as interference. Cold can do strange things to data, but one junior technician noted that the signal lasted longer than most anomalies. He marked the report and filed it away. The next morning, Daniel rose before the sun and resumed his climb. He had almost reached the ridge Emily had marked as her second critical checkpoint. The wind had dropped for a few hours. As he rounded the upper basin, his boot caught a crack, and he fell hard onto his side. Pain shot through his arm, but nothing broke. He pushed himself up and steadied against the slope. His glove brushed against a snow anchor drilled into the ice wall. Beside it was a small ribbon tied to a cord. The initials EH were inked faintly on its edge. She had been here, and not long ago. Far above him, Emily reached a high overlook and gazed across the range. She took a photograph with her analog camera, capturing the frozen skyline. Unseen in the far corner of the frame, a black speck moved along the opposite ridge. She would not notice it until months later. She zipped her coat and began preparing for the most treacherous stretch ahead, unaware that the mountain had already begun erasing the trail behind her. The upper ridge of Denali loomed like the edge of another world. Ice fluted across the slopes like hardened waves, and each gust of wind brought with it sharp needles of snow that scraped at Emily Harper's goggles. Visibility shrank to under 50 feet. The sky above was no longer blue, but a shade of silver gray that pressed down like a ceiling. Her breath formed quick clouds inside her face mask as she paused beside a Sarek to recheck her bearings. Her compass needle shook slightly as if unsure of itself. She lowered it, leaned on her ice axe, and scanned the jagged corridor ahead. The trail was gone. Wind had erased the prints she made only hours before. Even the flags she had planted along the crest were missing or buried. She adjusted her weight and moved forward one careful step at a time, following instinct instead of sign. Roughly 1 mile behind her and below the ridge wall, Daniel Harper was facing his own test of endurance. He had developed a sharp ache in his left knee from the earlier fall, and had begun compensating with shorter strides. The temperature had dropped again. His breath slowed. His skin along the cheekbones was beginning to peel under the harsh cold. He paused beside an ice shelf, surveyed the angle of the light above, and noticed the sharp shadow cast along the eastern rim. That edge led to the basin below the summit corridor. He checked his map and then folded it back into the pouch. He had two choices. He could descend slightly to intercept a safer route, or he could cross the ledge and risk thin ice for a shortcut. He knew her rhythm. She would take the direct path. He made his decision and began the climb. Emily pushed through the ridge gap just as a wave of clouds descended over the summit zone. It felt like moving through gauze. Her hands layered with wool liners and outer shells had begun to numb. She stopped beneath a snow overhang to eat a small protein square. As she leaned against the ice, she noticed something strange near the horizon, a black dot just above a narrow stretch of white. It did not move like wind-blown snow. It was slow, deliberate, irregular. It shifted right, then paused. She raised her goggles and blinked hard. When she looked again, it was gone. The fog swallowed it. She dismissed it as optical confusion and turned back to her route. From the northern shelf, a climber's drone camera captured the range at midday. The pilot, testing visibility for his own route, recorded 3 minutes of footage from above. Later, when reviewing the images, he noticed something odd. At minute 2, second 24, two figures appeared on the same ridge walking in opposite directions. One was clearly marked by a red jacket. The other, darker and lower, moved uncertainly. When the clip was paused, it showed them within the same frame. Neither had seen the other. That night, Emily reached a narrow plateau known as Falcon's Crest. The site had been used in warmer seasons for staging summit pushes. In winter, it was seldom visited. She set up her tent, secured the anchors, and unpacked her gear. As she lit her stove, her eyes wandered across the snowfield, and she felt an inexplicable heaviness. Not fear, not fatigue. Something quieter, like being watched. She zipped her coat higher and turned away from the wind. Her tent flapped once, then twice. In the dim light of her lantern, she reviewed her map and estimated she would reach the summit ridge by late afternoon tomorrow. She wrote a final entry for the day. Still cold. Trail gone, feet holding. Saw something strange. Not sure what it was. Daniel had taken shelter in a narrow crevasse after a sudden squall overtook his climb. He carved a seat into the ice and wrapped himself in a heat blanket, careful not to sleep. His mind drifted toward the last conversation he had with Sadie on the phone. Her voice was soft, uncertain. She had asked if he thought her mother would make it. He had promised to believe she would. He had never promised she would come back. Now he wondered if either of them would. As the wind howled above the ledge, he clutched the ribbon he had found days ago with Emily's initials. He whispered her name into the storm, not as a rescue call but as a prayer. The following morning brought clearer skies, but colder wind. Emily packed quickly, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. She crossed the plateau and began the final approach toward the summit basin. The trail was steep, winding between ice chimneys and hidden shelves. As she ascended, she noticed more strange patterns along the snow crust. Circular indentations too small for avalanche marks, too precise for natural formation. As she reached a narrow choke point, she stopped and knelt beside a small pile of ice. In the middle sat a single red carabiner clipped to a loop of webbing. She picked it up, wiped the frost away, and saw an engraved mark she had not seen in years, the initials DH. She stared at it, stunned. It had to be his, but he was not here. He could not be. Daniel was in fact just below the next ridge, climbing slowly, with stiff knees and shallow breath. He had fallen twice that morning, catching himself each time with his axe. His water supply was running low. He reached a snow ledge and sat down, pressing his hands together for warmth. As he looked up, he thought he saw movement on the far slope, a figure in red moving higher. He tried to call out, but his voice failed in the thin air. He stood again, shouted once more, but the wind swept his voice away. The figure kept climbing. Emily reached the ridge crest just as clouds rolled back in. The last visible sun struck the peaks behind her and cast long shadows across the valley. She stood motionless for a long moment, gazing toward the summit. Less than 1,000 feet remained. She turned to her pack, adjusted the straps, and began moving forward. Emily Harper entered the upper basin with deliberate steps, her movement slower now, but still measured. The slope curved into a wind tunnel between two jagged ice spires, and each step brought a thin squeal from the snow beneath her boots. Her breaths had shortened. Her pulse thumped against her eardrums. The air at this altitude was thin enough to confuse thought. She stopped and turned to check her surroundings. The white stretched in every direction, broken only by the ridgeline above and a peculiar shadow on the left flank. It was a structure partially sunken, built of aged wood and aluminum. She moved toward it with cautious relief. It was an old ranger hut, the kind used decades ago during the first major summit expeditions. Its roof had caved slightly on one side, and the door hung uneven on rusted hinges. She pulled it open with a gloved hand and stepped inside. The inside of the hut smelled like aged fabric and silence. An old canvas cot leaned in the corner, and a stack of melted snow gear was frozen to the far wall. A small desk remained beneath the window, half buried by snowdrift. On top sat a weather-stained logbook, its pages curled and gray. Emily peeled the cover back and scanned the most recent entries. Most were dated in the early 1990s. The final signature, however, chilled her more than the wind. It was hers. E. Harper. She blinked twice and looked again. The date was accurate, February 2004. She had not been here before. Her handwriting matched, but the ink was faint, almost smudged. She touched the page as if to confirm it was real. Her name sat alone at the top. Below it was another name, R. Davis. That name meant nothing to her. She turned the page again and saw only blank paper. She sat on the cot and rubbed warmth back into her legs. Her stomach had gone tight. Either she had visited the hut already and forgotten, or someone else had forged her name. Neither option made sense. She stood and searched the shelves. In a metal tin near the floor, she found 3 empty fuel canisters, a torn boot liner, and a picture frame with no photo inside. She packed the logbook and stepped outside. The sun had dropped behind the far ridge. She pitched her tent near the shelter and boiled water. Her journal entry that evening was short. Found hut. Found my name. Do not remember being there. Daniel Harper reached the basin trailhead that same afternoon. His legs had started to cramp and his throat burned from breathing dry air. As he rose past a steep snowpatch, his pole struck wood. He looked down and saw a ladder half buried beneath the snow. He followed its path upward and saw the same ranger hut Emily had found hours before. He approached slowly, every step cautious. He opened the door and froze. Inside, the snow was still disturbed. A boot print marked the center. He stepped in and moved to the desk. The logbook was missing. He touched the desk's surface. It was warm, barely as if touched not long ago. He turned and saw a scarf caught on the cot's corner. It was dark green, embroidered with a floral edge. He knew it. It belonged to Emily. He picked it up and held it against his chest. That night he stayed outside the hut, curled beside his tent, unable to sleep. He kept the scarf around his neck and watched the stars swirl above. For a moment he believed she had to be close. Her trail was still warm. She was alive. In the morning he left a message carved in a patch of ice with his crampon tip. I found you. Keep moving. I am coming. 2 miles east, a descending climber reported seeing movement on the ridge the evening prior. He had not been able to identify the climber, but the figure had stood beside a weather hut for several minutes before disappearing into a rock chute. The climber passed the report along to the Park Service, but by then the storm system was already pushing into the range. The wind returned with icy intent and visibility shrank to near zero. No rescues were dispatched. No routes were altered. Emily awoke the next morning with a headache and blood on her lip from where she had bitten down during sleep. The cold had pressed against her like a weight all night. Her fingers burned when she removed her gloves to prepare her gear. She boiled what remained of her drinking water and repacked her sled. Before she left, she stood at the doorway of the hut and stared back inside. She whispered one word into the quiet. Then she turned away. Daniel had resumed his climb, but the wind worked against him. His pace slowed by the hour. His right shoulder began to throb from a tendon he had injured years earlier during a glacier rescue. He reached the top of the ridge and scanned the white before him. A trail of faint indentations led westward. He followed them, carefully watching the sky. The clouds broke once, just long enough to show the peak of Denali in full light. He paused and stared at it. He mouthed his daughter's name once, then continued onward. Midday, Emily reached a narrow gorge known as Lark's Throat. It was steep and wind-blown. She adjusted her crampons, tested the ice, and crossed with precision. Her muscles ached, and she could feel the tremor beginning in her knees. As she moved across a ledge, her boot caught an edge and she dropped to one knee. She took a deep breath, pushed upward, and kept moving. At the far edge of the gorge, she stopped and looked back. She saw nothing but snow. But a breeze came through the gap carrying a faint smell of fuel as if someone had burned a stove nearby. She inhaled again. Then she kept walking. Daniel reached the same gorge hours later. He stopped at the edge and saw the drag marks in the snow where she had fallen. He stepped carefully across. On the far side, he found a trail of 3 small objects: a plastic spoon, a protein bar wrapper, and a pen with no cap. He picked them up and stored them inside his coat. She was ahead of him. Not far. Maybe a day. He set up camp and lit a stove. His hands were shaking now, but not from fear. That evening, Emily made camp beside a snowbank shaped like a crescent. She dug in and built a barrier of ice blocks to shield against wind. She sat with her legs curled beneath her and pulled out her daughter's letter again. She read the words slowly, then placed the letter against her chest beneath her jacket. She closed her eyes for several minutes, then opened them and wrote into her log. Day 16. Still no voice. Still no sign. The mountain listens. It just does not speak. Emily Harper awoke on the 17th day with her eyes crusted from the cold and a pressure behind her ears that throbbed with every movement. The wind had calmed overnight, but the silence brought its own kind of tension. She emerged from the tent, slowly brushed snow from her parka, and stretched her legs. Her knees cracked beneath the weight of the altitude. She boiled water carefully, using the last of her fuel, and consumed half a ration of oatmeal before packing her gear. Her gloves slipped slightly as she tightened her sled straps. She made a mental note to double-layer them when she started moving. The ridge before her was long and sloped toward a narrow descent path known by few winter climbers. It had once been used as an emergency evacuation corridor. She traced it with her eyes, measuring angles, distances, escape points. Her breath fogged her goggles. She wiped them clear, turned her back to the shelters she had built, and began moving down. As she descended into the basin, the wind picked up again, curling through the rock corridors like a river through stone. Emily's movement slowed as she reached the midpoint, where frost lines marked places where previous climbers had once waited for rescue or met a different end. She passed them silently, her feet crunching through layers of crusted snow. She knew this descent would be the hardest part. It was where the cold reached deeper and decision-making slowed from lack of oxygen. Her radio was quiet. Her GPS remained black. She moved forward out of necessity, not trust. Midway down the slope, she slipped on a patch of glare ice and landed hard on her left hip. Pain shot through her lower back. She lay still for a moment, then rolled to her side and pushed up with her pole. The world spun briefly. She held her breath until the dizziness passed, then checked for injuries. Nothing broken. She kept going. Daniel Harper was crossing a high ledge when the wind knocked him sideways. He braced himself against the wall and waited. The ice crackled beneath his boots. He adjusted his pack and steadied his breathing. Below him, the path narrowed into a chute lined by ridges that formed a funnel. That funnel led directly into the basin Emily had entered hours earlier. He had followed her prints for over a mile, but now they were gone. The storm had swept through with heavy drifts. He scanned the valley with his binoculars and saw nothing but white. He took a sip from his water pouch and lowered the lens. He knew she had passed this way. He could feel it. He started down the chute, his boots sinking halfway to the ankle with each step. A ridge of blue ice shimmered to his left, marking where glacial water had frozen against the slope years ago. He pressed his hand to it, felt the chill move into his bones, then continued. Near the midpoint of the basin, Emily stopped to rest beneath a ledge. She sat on her sled and stared into the distance, trying to gauge how much ground she had left. Her thoughts moved slowly. She pulled out her daughter's letter again and reread it, lips moving with the words, though no sound escaped. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded it back into her coat. As she shifted her weight to stand, she noticed a small red flag in the snow about 20 feet to her left. She moved toward it and discovered a sealed dry bag tied beneath it. Inside was a folded rain poncho, a chemical heating pad, and a note written in sharp marker. Almost there. Keep moving. The handwriting was Daniel's. She froze with the note in her hand, staring at the words. She scanned the ridge above the cliffs behind her. No movement. She called his name once. The wind took her voice. Further down the chute, Daniel reached the end of a narrow trail where a half-collapsed crevasse ran along the ridge. He checked his footing and began searching for a place to set camp. He had only a few hours of daylight left and needed to recover energy before continuing. He removed his gloves to better adjust the tent poles, then winced as the skin of his fingers split slightly from the cold. He ignored the pain, finished setting camp, and lit his last stove cartridge. As he waited for the flame to settle, he pulled out his map. His pen traced the slope ahead. He would reach the lower ridge by noon tomorrow. He leaned back against his pack and looked toward the sky. It had begun to snow lightly. He whispered her name once, then closed his eyes for a moment longer than he intended. Emily reached the edge of the lower basin as the last light faded. The terrain flattened briefly, revealing an open field that shimmered with wind-polished snow. She crossed it carefully, eyes scanning the ridge lines. A distant howl echoed once, maybe the wind, or maybe an animal, but she did not look back. Her vision had started to blur at the edges. She set up a minimalist shelter and crawled inside. Her body ached from cold and effort. She wrapped herself in a foil blanket and pulled her hat low. Her journal remained in her pocket. She had no words left for the page. The following morning, a ranger stationed 50 miles south of Denali received a burst transmission from a tracking satellite used for monitoring geological shifts. The signal carried what appeared to be a distress code but with unusual coordinates. The point was located near the eastern rim of the glacier basin, far from standard paths. He noted it, filed the alert, and forwarded the ping to Anchorage Search Control. No teams were dispatched. The signal was flagged as likely interference. Daniel woke early and packed his gear in silence. He could feel his muscles straining now. The cold had settled into his joints. He began moving before the sky had brightened, relying on instinct to guide him through the basin curve. The path narrowed as he approached a windbreak where the snow had built up waist-high. He climbed over it and paused. There, in the snow ahead, were drag marks, deep and wide, the kind left by a sled pulled in exhaustion. He dropped to his knees and touched them. He followed them forward. Emily stood at the edge of the basin where the trail curved toward a final rise. She looked up at the slope, her legs trembling beneath her. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon. Her water was frozen. She inhaled slowly, removed her scarf, and looked to the horizon. She whispered something into the air. She took one step forward, then another. Emily Harper moved through the lower basin with her gait uneven and her body leaning slightly to the left. The fall had injured her hip more than she first realized. She had wrapped the joint with compression tape the night before, but every step now sent a pulse of pain up through her ribs. She pressed forward, each footstep an act of will. The wind had softened for the moment, giving her a clearer view of the valley ahead. The snow was undisturbed. No signs of animals. No marks of other climbers. Just a clean white path leading into the shadow of the next ridge. Her breathing had shortened into shallow puffs. She focused her gaze on a distant cluster of rock formations, marking them as her next rest point. Her sled scraped behind her across the packed surface. The sound felt louder than it should have, echoing in the cold silence like the rustle of paper in a cathedral. Somewhere further behind her, Daniel Harper crested a narrow saddle and stopped to scan the terrain. He had reached a higher vantage point and could now see a wider arc of the basin. He crouched behind a frozen outcrop and pulled out his binoculars. The ice on the lenses cracked slightly from the temperature shift, but he could still see through the center. He panned slowly, sweeping from left to right. Then he saw it. A faint indentation in the snow, not recent but not old either. A drag line with a boot trail beside it. His heart kicked once. He adjusted focus and saw something else. A half-buried object halfway down the slope. He packed up and descended with renewed urgency. Emily reached the rock formation she had marked earlier and sat on a flat patch of snow between two angled boulders. She took off one glove and reached into her pack for a protein gel. Her fingers were stiff and slow. She bit off the cap and squeezed the contents into her mouth, then forced herself to swallow. It tasted metallic and sour, but it would keep her moving. She leaned her head against the stone and let her eyes close for 10 seconds. The cold pulled her back awake. She looked around again. To her right, the snow curved upward into a small hill. At the top, just visible against the gray sky, stood a dark shape. It looked like a person. She blinked hard and looked again. The shape was gone. She told herself it had been wind-blown ice. Nothing more. That evening, a pair of climbers making their winter ascent from the southern route reported an unusual sight to the ranger station. One of them claimed to have seen a woman standing motionless near the edge of the basin, her parka red and torn at the sleeve. When they approached, she had vanished. The coordinates placed the sighting close to Emily's last known location, but the report was filed as a likely misidentification or light reflection. No search action followed. Daniel reached the half-buried object he had seen through his lens. It was a cooking pot, dented and frost-covered. Inside it was a wrapped cloth holding a tea bag and a lighter. On the inside lip of the pot were 3 letters scratched with a knife, E.H. He pressed his fingers against the mark and then looked up at the tracks continuing west. He shouted her name once into the air. His voice echoed back faintly, but with no answer. He picked up the pot and packed it into his sled, then resumed his path along her trail. Emily had found a snow ridge with natural walls that created a break from the wind. She cleared an area with her shovel and set her emergency bivouac. Her fingers trembled as she worked not from fear, but from exhaustion. She checked her water pouch and found only slush. She wrapped it in her jacket and tucked it inside her clothing to thaw. She pulled out her daughter's letter and reread it under the lantern's dim light. Her lips moved silently with each word. Then she folded it back and slid it beneath her base layer. She stared at the fabric of her tent for a long time before she closed her eyes. That night, the wind returned with sudden force. It pressed against the sides of her shelter and howled through the rocks. She woke with a start, unsure if the sound outside was natural or not. Then she heard it again. A soft scraping just beyond the tent. She held her breath and listened. Nothing followed. She unzipped the door slowly and looked out. The snow reflected pale moonlight. No shapes moved, no prints marked the ground. She waited for several minutes, then closed the flap and returned to her blanket. Her hands would not stop shaking. She whispered her daughter's name like a lullaby and tried to sleep. Daniel camped that night against the base of a narrow cliffside. He had found more signs of her trail, including a boot print partially filled with fresh snow. It had not been there the day before. She was moving slowly, but still ahead. He boiled a small pot of water, added 2 sugar cubes, and drank carefully. He took out a folded photograph from his chest pocket. It showed Emily and Sadie beneath a pine tree, both wearing scarves. He stared at it in the dim light, then placed it inside the inner sleeve of his jacket. The following morning brought a deep calm. The sky above the basin opened for the first time in days, revealing a stretch of bright blue and high sun. Emily rose with stiff limbs and packed her gear slowly. She looked thinner in her reflection on the pot lid. Her cheeks were hollow and her eyes ringed with purple. She moved with determination but without speed. She crossed the open basin with her eyes fixed on the far ridgeline. Halfway across, she turned to look behind her and thought she saw movement near the rocks. It was gone when she looked again. By midday, Daniel reached a narrow gully where the snow had thinned from wind exposure. There, he found a scarf snagged on a rock spike. He pulled it loose and held it in both hands. It was green with floral edges. He had seen it before. He pressed it to his lips and then tucked it into his coat. He followed the trail beyond the gully and saw fresh prints leading upward. He started climbing again. At the edge of the southern shelf, where the cliffs began to curve eastward, a park ranger named Wes Murdoch guided a small drill team across a hardened snowbank. It was the final sweep of their 2-week geological survey. They were not searching for climbers not that far from the season's routes. Their task was to document glacier tension and ice layer drift. Murdoch was a veteran of these expeditions, quiet and exacting, known for working without pause and speaking only when necessary. As the midday sun reached its highest point, his ice drill struck something beneath the crust that gave off a dull metallic note. He stopped, tapped the shaft again, and called for help. The team cleared a space 2 feet wide and unearthed a sealed container. It was military-grade faded olive green, coated with frost, and marked only by 2 scratched letters EH. The box was heavier than expected. Inside, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket, they found a weather-worn journal, a flare gun, and a laminated map with handwritten notes. Murdoch opened the journal and scanned the first page. The handwriting was sharp, clear, and female. The name signed beneath the first entry matched what he had just seen on the lid, Emily Harper. The last dated page read February 19, 2004. He stared at the date for a long moment, then turned to the final entry. The words were written with uneven strokes and the last lines trailed downward across the page. The journal detailed Emily's solo attempt, the freezing nights in the ice trenches, the wind that tore at her shelter, and the injuries she downplayed until the words began to break. In one passage, she wrote about finding the ranger hut and seeing her own name in the logbook before realizing she had no memory of writing it. In another entry, she described shadows she believed were Daniel watching from a distance, but it was the last paragraph that held Murdoch in place. It spoke of a man with her in the storm, a man who helped her stand when her legs gave out, who fed her from his own rations, and wrapped her hands in his coat when she could no longer feel her fingers. She never wrote his name, but the man's description was unmistakable. It was Daniel Harper. Meanwhile, not far from the site where the journal was discovered, Daniel continued his silent advance. His left leg was now dragging slightly from a pulled tendon. His water had nearly run out and his breath came in bursts. He had started whispering to himself, repeating short mantras to stay awake. At a ridge overlooking the lower basin, he saw the snowfield stretch into the narrow pass beyond. There were no visible prints, but he sensed movement had passed through. The wind carved the path, quickly erasing detail but not the direction. He set 1 foot forward and kept moving, driven not by certainty but by refusal to stop. Emily rested beneath a jagged overhang in the same lower basin, her legs curled into her chest, and her eyes closed beneath frosted lashes. She had stopped recording her position 2 days ago. Her notebook remained sealed in a plastic sleeve untouched. Her hands no longer gripped with precision. She moved her fingers only when necessary. The cold had started taking small pieces of her. Her left foot no longer felt pain. Her right eye had blurred along the edge of her vision, but her breath still rose in shallow puffs. She looked at her sled and made herself stand. She did not want to sleep anymore. Sleep had started to feel like letting go. Back at the base station, Murdoch contacted the regional field office and relayed the find. The ranger supervisor on duty reviewed the scanned journal pages and verified the handwriting with old park documents. The name Daniel Harper surfaced in conversation. A report had been filed years ago by a colleague who mentioned Daniel departing for Alaska without official purpose shortly after his ex-wife Emily had gone missing. The two stories, once unrelated, now intersected on the same glacier. The field office marked the discovery for review but issued no new deployment. The terrain was considered too dangerous to authorize a search without confirmed coordinates of a living subject. Later, that same afternoon, Murdoch walked alone to a ridge above their camp, holding the journal against his chest. He looked across the snowfield where climbers rarely passed and wondered how many stories the mountain had kept buried. He opened the journal again to the second-to-last page. It described a brief scene in quiet detail. Emily had lost her footing and could not rise. The man she described had lifted her onto the sled and stayed beside her until the wind passed. She never saw where he came from. She only knew he did not speak. She believed he was real. She wrote that his hands were cracked from the cold and that his boots matched a pair she remembered from before. She ended the entry with one sentence. I did not imagine him. I never could. That evening, Daniel reached a snowdrift bent against the eastern rock wall. There he found a folded glove with a name tag sewn on the inside. It was hers. He sat beside it, knees shaking, and cried for the first time since leaving Anchorage. The wind passed over him in soft waves as if the mountain had lowered its voice. Far below, a small climbing group reviewed an archived summit photo from earlier in the month. One of the members had taken a wide shot of the upper basin during dawn. When zoomed in, the image showed two faint figures walking through the southern corridor. One wore red, the other wore black. Both leaned forward under weight. The photo had been dismissed as a visual echo. Now it was submitted to the park archive under a new title, Possible Sighting of Harper Party February. Emily sat beneath a small overhang and looked out at the dusk sky. Her hands were wrapped in layers of cloth and her coat was pulled tight around her neck. Her sled sat beside her with the remaining supplies packed neatly. She no longer felt urgency, only direction. She leaned back and looked at the stars rising behind the peaks. She whispered two names. One was her daughter's, the other was Daniel's. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of a frozen corridor where a sheer wall of ice rose to his left and a steep descent fell to his right. The wind had calmed, but the sky remained gray and heavy, pressed close like a blanket that would not lift. He could no longer feel the toes of his left foot. His hands ached with a deep sting despite the layers wrapped around them. In his chest, he carried the heat of a memory not from the past, but from the pages of Emily's journal, which he had never seen yet, had lived alongside. He was nearing the end of his strength, but the trail she left behind had grown more certain. Footprints still marked the snow here and there. The direction was clear. He no longer needed a map. He needed only movement. Back at Denali Base Station, the regional field office received a second report from the same geological crew. Along with the journal, they had found a collapsed thermal shelter about 80 yards from the original site. Inside were two sets of gear, half a packet of freeze-dried food, and a boot with a cracked sole. A pair of ice axes had been jammed into the snow to support the shelter's frame. Both axes bore initials, one said EH and the other DH. Rangers began reviewing past climbing records again, searching for any overlap between Emily and Daniel's disappearances. A quiet discussion unfolded in the control room, but no team was dispatched. The weather in that section had turned again. Emily had reached a point where rest became as dangerous as walking. She moved forward because the body in motion kept heat. Her shoulders slumped beneath her coat. Her breath remained shallow. She had lost track of hours, even of light. Her world narrowed to the rhythm of her boots, the slide of her sled, and the ache in her hips and spine. Somewhere behind her, she believed Daniel might still be coming. That belief was not logical, but it had become a structure inside her. Without it, she would have no reason to continue. She paused beside a slanted rock, touched it for balance, and left behind a red ribbon she had tied to her pack days earlier. She did not remember why she did it. She just kept walking. Daniel reached the ribbon late that afternoon. It fluttered gently in the breeze, the only movement in the stillness around him. He recognized it immediately. Emily had once worn it braided through her hair during a spring hike in Utah when they were still married. She had tied it to her backpack on this climb as a keepsake from Sadie. He plucked it free and folded it into his pocket. Ahead of him, the slope narrowed into a steep pass. He adjusted the straps on his shoulders and descended. At Anchorage Search Control, a retired climber named Jonah Pierce reviewed the photographs submitted by the earlier expedition. He studied the shapes in the snow and compared their orientation to the basin's known ridge lines. What caught his attention was not just the two figures moving side by side, but the faint shadow stretching behind them. The person in black appeared to be carrying the person in red. The weight of that detail hit him in the gut. He emailed the photo to the regional rangers and recommended archival review. Still, no mission was ordered. The season was nearing its end. Risk protocols remained strict. Emily stumbled near the base of a wind-carved embankment and fell hard into the snow. Her sled rolled once and came to a stop just ahead. She lay still, panting her face against the frozen ground. The pain in her ribs had become a steady throb. Her hands no longer felt objects. She used her elbows to push herself upright. A sharp crack in her knee warned her not to attempt another fall. She dragged herself to the sled and used it to stand. She did not cry. She did not speak. She just reached for a scarf in her pocket and wrapped it tighter around her face. Her thoughts had slowed to fragments, but one remained sharp. I must keep moving. Daniel reached the top of a snowbank and looked down into the final stretch of the basin. There he saw something that brought him to his knees. The drag marks from her sled curved to the right toward the shelter of a rock outcrop. Near the center of the flat, a dark object lay beside the sled. He slid down the slope in quick steps, ignoring the pain in his foot. When he reached the shelter, he saw her. Emily was curled against the rock wall, her coat still zipped, her hair frosted at the edge. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were slightly parted. He dropped to her side and touched her face. The skin was cold, but not gone. He lifted her in both arms, pulled her into his lap, and wrapped his coat around her. He whispered her name again and again. Emily opened her eyes once. She saw a shape that looked like Daniel. She could not tell if he was real. Her vision flickered like a dying flame. She moved her lips and said one word, "Stay." Then her head fell back against his chest. Daniel held her tighter, rocked her slightly, and pressed his forehead against hers. The storm began to rise again. The next morning, a reconnaissance drone passed over the region. The ranger station had authorized a mapping update. The footage revealed a narrow path cutting through the southern basin. Near a cluster of rocks, two small forms could be seen, one upright, one prone. The ranger who reviewed the footage marked the location for follow-up, but it was already too late. Years later, Sadie Harper stood at the edge of Denali's southern lookout platform with her fingers curled around a steel guardrail. The wind was mild for early spring, brushing the strands of her dark hair away from her face as she stared at the white spine of the mountain range ahead. She wore a thick navy coat and a wool scarf, not because the cold threatened her, but because it brought her closer to them. Her boots pressed into packed snow where dozens of visitors passed each day unaware of the invisible weight she carried. She had returned not as a climber, but as a daughter who had inherited silence instead of stories. The National Park Service had invited her to attend the dedication of a new glacier research site named Harper Field Station. She had accepted the invitation without hesitation, but had spoken little since arriving. Now she waited not for ceremony, but for closure. A few days before her arrival, an independent expedition had uncovered a frozen satchel sealed inside a snow cave 15 miles east of the main route. The cave had been mapped by climbers years earlier but never fully explored due to its unstable ledges. This time, the team entered during a rare window of calm. Inside, they found scattered remnants of gear, a melted-down thermal mat, and a metal container marked with initials. Inside the container was a sat phone, a voice recorder, a stack of old maps, and a pair of gloves wrapped in a thermal blanket. The name stitched inside the gloves was Emily Harper. One of the climbers, a former park guide named Lucas Grant, reviewed the contents at base camp and immediately contacted Anchorage Search Control. The device had survived the years due to the temperature seal inside the cave. When powered on, the sat phone did not connect, but the voice recorder flashed with power. Lucas played the first audio file and froze. The voice was male gravelly and deliberate. The recording had been made in short intervals marked by timestamps from February 2004. The speaker identified himself as Daniel Harper. The message began as a survival log tracking their descent and conditions. Then, as the days progressed, it became something else. It became a confession. Sadie received the news from a park ranger late in the evening, just hours before she was due to fly out. The ranger offered to send her a copy of the recordings or to play them privately at her request. She chose the latter. In a quiet office above the ranger station, she sat alone with headphones over her ears and listened to her father's voice for the first time in over a decade. His tone was steady, stripped of bravado, filled with pauses where words seemed too heavy to lift. He spoke of how he followed Emily from a distance, knowing she would never have allowed him to come if she knew. He spoke of finding her after days of near misses, and of the moment he realized she would not make it back down. Daniel described how he stayed with her in the snow cave for 3 nights, giving her his coat, his water, and half of the food he had reserved for his own climb out. He spoke of holding her when she no longer responded, of watching her breathing slow, of whispering stories about their daughter, even when he knew she could no longer hear. He admitted that he had made a choice not to leave. He could have descended. He might have survived, but he had promised her once long ago never to let her die alone. He ended the final recording with a line that would stay with Sadie forever. If anyone finds this, let her be remembered not for how she died, but for how far she climbed. The following morning, Sadie visited the archive tent where the recovered items were being cataloged. A staff member handed her the small metal box, its surface dented but intact. She opened it slowly. Inside, beneath the maps and gloves, she found a folded piece of lined paper. The handwriting was her father's. The message was short. "Tell her I saw her all the way through." She folded the note again and placed it back in the box. She stood in silence for several minutes, her hands resting on the lid. Later that day, she hiked with a small team of park staff to the ice cave where the box had been found. The entrance had partially collapsed, but the route was still visible. The cave walls were slick with condensation. Her boots echoed slightly as she stepped inside. At the far end, a simple cairn of stones had been built. A climbing rope hung above it, looped in a spiral. A ranger told her that they believed Daniel had built the cairn after Emily's final breath, that he had taken time to prepare a place not for burial, but for memory. No plaque marked the spot. No names carved into the stone. Only a scarf, faded green with a floral trim tied to a loop at the top. Sadie sat beside the cairn for a long time, her breath fogging gently in the cold air. She did not cry. Instead, she spoke aloud the same way her father had spoken into the recorder. She told her mother she had made it through college. She told her father she still remembered his stories. She thanked them both for being brave enough to climb even if it meant she had to grow up alone. She placed a new note beside the cairn, sealed in a plastic pouch. It read, "I found you. I saw you both all the way through." As the group descended from the cave, a soft snow began to fall. The wind carried no bite, only a hush. No one spoke for several minutes. In the distance, the southern wall of Denali rose against a sky that had cleared just enough to let the light pass through. The morning light touched the northern slope of Denali with a quiet that seemed to pause time. At an altitude where the air pressed harder with each breath, 2 silhouettes moved carefully along the edge of the eastern ridge. One was Sadie Harper, now 33, wearing a navy thermal jacket and boots lined for Arctic terrain. The other was Lucas Grant, the expedition leader who had first uncovered the satchel with her father's final recordings. They climbed without conversation, each focused on the trail ahead and the rhythm of their steps. Sadie had returned with a purpose more personal than ceremony. She had requested permission from the National Park Service to locate and document the exact coordinates of her parents' final shelter, not as a tourist, not as a visitor, but as a daughter, reclaiming what had remained buried for too long. The approval came with restrictions, but the rangers allowed her one guide, one route, and one day. That was all she needed. The snow had softened during the late melt, making the terrain more navigable, but no less dangerous. Sadie paused at the bend of a narrow pass and looked out across the basin. Below her lay the glacier corridor where both of her parents had vanished 12 years earlier. She had grown up with their absence folded into her daily life like a seam that never quite lay flat. As a child, she imagined them frozen in time, caught between moments. As an adult, she had carried their memory in the space between her thoughts, always just behind the decisions she made. She had become a therapist working with children who had lost parents, and in every story she listened to, she heard pieces of her own. She never spoke of it in the room. She only listened. She only helped others make sense of what had never made sense to her. But now she was here, feet planted in the snow where their story had ended, ready to give it the weight of something real. Lucas adjusted his pack and pointed toward a ridge 50 yards ahead. The cave entrance had shifted since its first discovery, partially collapsed by a snow shelf months earlier. Sadie nodded once and followed. Her breaths were measured. Her gaze never drifted. When they reached the mouth of the cave, she stepped inside first. The air was still and heavy with a cold that settled beneath the skin. The rocks were layered with frost. Her boots crunched lightly on the frozen ground. She saw the cairn where her parents had been found, still intact, still marked by the same floral-trimmed scarf she had tied in place years ago. A new layer of snow dusted the edges, but the rope loop and stone pile remained undisturbed. She knelt beside it and placed her hand on the top stone. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember without interruption. She remembered the way her mother's handwriting slanted to the left, and how she used to tuck notes into lunch boxes even when she was too old for them. She remembered how her father always arrived 5 minutes early for every event, and how he smelled faintly of pine soap and cold air. She remembered the last morning she saw them together before the divorce had separated their paths, and how they had smiled at each other across the breakfast table as if nothing had broken between them. That was the memory she had clung to when everything else was taken. That was the version of them she carried into adulthood, whole and unfinished. Sadie opened her pack and removed a small wooden box she had carved herself. Inside was a new journal blank, except for the first page where she had written a dedication. For the ones who kept going when every part of them said stop. For the ones who held each other through the cold. She placed the box beside the cairn and pressed it gently into the snow. Lucas stepped back and gave her space. She did not speak. She only sat for several minutes, her head bowed, her hand resting on the scarf. The silence of the cave held them both. Outside, the wind shifted and brought with it a gust of fine snow. The mountain above remained unmoved, its face carved by centuries of storms. Sadie stood slowly and turned to Lucas. He nodded understanding without needing explanation. They began their descent in silence. Each step away from the cave did not lessen the weight she carried, but it reshaped it into something new. It was no longer a question. It was no longer a wound left open. It had become a place, a fixed point in the world where her parents had made their final stand not in defeat, but in devotion. They had found each other in the most unforgiving place on earth, and together they had faced the end not as strangers or ex-lovers, but as the two people who had once promised to protect something greater than themselves. Later that year, the National Park Service published a report updating the public on the confirmed recovery site of the Harper shelter. The report included coordinates, environmental details, and a short passage written by Sadie. In it, she described not the loss, but the unity. She described how two lives crossed again in the final stretch of their journey, and how that intersection became more than a tragedy. It became a monument to endurance. It became the answer to a child's question. Did they make it? The answer had never been no. The answer was they made it as far as anyone ever could. and they did it together. In the years that followed, Sadie returned twice more to the mountain, once alone, and once with a small group of students she mentored. Each time she spoke only briefly of what had happened, then allowed the silence to speak for itself. She understood now that some stories do not need retelling in order to remain alive. They live in the way people move forward. They live in the way people stand up after falling. They live in the way a daughter learns not to ask why, but to ask what comes next. At the entrance of Denali's southern trailhead, a wooden sign was added to the welcome post. It bore no dedication plaque, no dates, no dramatic engraving. It simply read, "The Harper Way." Below it, carved into the wood with quiet care, were the words, "Leave no one behind." If this story moved, you take a moment to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives based on true endurance and quiet heroism. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear what the Harper story meant to you.